in for one of the most exciting and harmonious nights of the year. An unsettling sequence of events that would go on to captivate a nation for decades was just getting underway.
Laci Denise Rocha was born on May 4, 1975, in Modesto, California, the youngest child in a family that would describe her from the very start as a spark of energy. Her mother, Sharon Rocha, remembered her as a baby who smiled easily, even in the quiet hours of the night. She had an older brother, Brent, who grew protective of her early on, a dynamic that carried through their whole lives. Her parents divorced when she was still young, but both remained present in her life, raising her in the kind of small-town California environment where neighbors knew each other and families gathered for barbecues in backyards. Modesto was agricultural. Country, flat stretches of farmland, orchards heavy with almonds and peaches, and quiet neighborhoods shaded by old trees. Laci's childhood was filled with family traditions, big holiday meals, camping trips, and afternoons spent in her mother's garden. Sharon's home was filled with color and warmth, and Laci absorbed those qualities like sunlight. Friends from her school years later said she was the kind of girl who lit up a room, someone whose laugh could pull people in from across the hall. By high school, Laci's social nature was matched by a streak of determination. She loved fashion and had a knack for putting together outfits that felt effortlessly stylish. She played sports casually, cheerleading for a time, but her real passion was in social activities and building friendships. Teachers recalled her as both kind and assertive, someone who stood up for others and knew how to take charge when needed. After graduating from Thomas Downey High School, Laci enrolled at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. The move took her a few hours away from home, close enough to visit often, but far enough to have the independence she craved. She majored in ornamental horticulture, drawn to the idea of working with plants and design, perhaps even running her own floral business one day. College life suited her. She made friends easily, joined campus activities, and kept in close touch with her family, especially her mother. It was in San Luis Obispo, in 1994, that she walked into a small cafe called Pacific Cafe and met a young man who would change the trajectory of her life. Scott Peterson was working there part-time while studying agricultural business at Cal Poly. Tall, clean-cut, and polite, he had the easy charm of someone used to making a good impression. Laci noticed him immediately. According to her friends, she was the one who made the first move, striking up a conversation that led to her slipping him her phone number before she left. Their courtship was fast and magnetic. Laci told friends she knew within weeks that Scott was the one she wanted to marry. He, in turn, seemed equally smitten, taking her on dates to local beaches and introducing her to his friends. They shared common ground in their studies, both connected to agriculture and in their ambitions. Scott spoke of wanting to own a business someday. Laci dreamed of building a home filled with family. By 1997, they were married in a small, elegant ceremony, surrounded by family and friends. The early years of their marriage were marked by travel, shared hobbies like golfing and cooking, and a sense of building a future together. In 1999, they moved to Modesto, settling into a modest but comfortable home on Covina Avenue. Scott took a job as a fertilizer salesman for a company called Trade Corp USA, a position that required travel but paid well enough for them to begin planning for bigger things. Laci embraced homemaking, filling their house with seasonal decorations, and planning gatherings. In 2002, after several years of marriage, they learned Laci was pregnant. She was overjoyed. Friends said she dove into preparing for motherhood with the same enthusiasm she brought to everything else, reading parenting books, planning the nursery in cheerful yellows and blues, and keeping up with prenatal appointments. She and Scott decided to name their baby boy Connor, a name they both loved. By December 2002, Laci was 8 months pregnant. The holidays that year carried an extra layer of excitement. It would be their last Christmas as just the two of them, and they were eager to welcome their first child in February. Laci had been busy in the days leading up to Christmas Eve, shopping for gifts, baking cookies, and making plans for the family gathering at her parents' home. December 23rd was an ordinary day in Modesto, cool and clear. Laci spoke to her mother that evening on the phone, discussing what time they'd meet for Christmas festivities. Nothing in her voice or words suggested worry or trouble. Scott said they watched television together that night before going to bed. The next morning, December 24th, Scott claimed he woke up around 8 a.m. and decided to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina, an unusual choice for a man whose wife was 8 months pregnant on Christmas Eve, but one he insisted was part of his plan for the day. Laci, he said, was going to clean the house, bake, and run errands before heading to her mother's. According to Scott, she was wearing a white shirt and black pants when he last saw her at BY that evening. Laci was missing. When she failed to show up at her parents' home and didn't answer her phone, her family's concerns spiked quickly. They knew her well enough to know she wouldn't simply vanish without calling. Sharon and Ron, Laci's stepfather, began calling around to friends and neighbors, while Scott claimed he returned home to find her car in the driveway, the front door unlocked, and no sign of her inside. The dog, their golden retriever named Mackenzie, was in the yard with his leash still attached, something that immediately struck the family as wrong. By nightfall, police were involved, and what began as a missing person report would soon ignite into one of the most sensational murder cases in modern American history. The first hours of the search for Laci Peterson unfolded with the frantic urgency that families of the missing know too well. It was Christmas Eve, a day when streets were alive with last-minute shoppers and homes glowed with the smell of baking and the sound of holiday music. Against that backdrop, the absence of a young, vibrant, 8 months pregnant woman struck everyone in her orbit as immediately wrong. When Sharon Rocha got the call that her daughter had not arrived and could not be reached, she felt the first ripple of dread. Laci was punctual, thoughtful, and deeply attached to her family. She would not simply fail to show up on such an important day without warning. Sharon called her daughter's house, but there was no answer. Scott, when reached, told her he'd been fishing at the Berkeley Marina and had just returned to find Laci gone. The details he gave in those first moments were sparse. He said her Land Rover was parked in the driveway, the door unlocked. The family dog, Mackenzie, was in the backyard with his leash on. That image, the leash still clipped to the collar, burned into Sharon's mind. Laci would never leave the dog that way. Ron, her stepfather, called the Modesto Police Department to report her missing, stressing her advanced pregnancy and the fact that she had not contacted anyone all day. Officers arrived quickly. At first, the case was treated with a mix of concern and protocol. Adults are legally allowed to be missing unless foul play is suspected. But the combination of her pregnancy, the unattended dog, and the absence of her wallet or keys pushed the responding officers to take it seriously from the start. Word spread quickly among the Rocha family and Laci's friends. By nightfall, people were out canvassing the neighborhood, calling her name, knocking on doors, and asking anyone if they'd seen her. Neighbors recalled seeing Laci in the days prior, walking Mackenzie, but no one could say for certain they had seen her on the morning of the 24th. The initial hope was that she might have gone somewhere unexpectedly and been delayed, maybe visiting a friend or running an errand. But as the hours ticked past midnight into Christmas Day, that hope dimmed. The holiday dawned under a cloud for everyone connected to Laci. Detectives began retracing her last known movements. They took statements from Scott and from family members. Scott repeated his account. He'd gone to the Berkeley Marina that morning to fish for sturgeon, a trip that required a 90-mile drive from Modesto. His explanation struck some as odd. Why choose such an outing on Christmas Eve with a pregnant wife at home? But investigators logged it and moved forward. While officers checked marinas and parks, volunteers began a grassroots search. Laci's picture, her bright smile, long brown hair, and the unmistakable pregnancy glow, was printed on flyers and distributed around Modesto. Local news picked up the story quickly. The angle of a missing pregnant woman during the holidays too striking to ignore. By December 26th, the search had expanded. The Peterson home became a base of operations for volunteers. Police searched local waterways and open fields, using helicopters and boats. Scott, photographed by news crews, appeared calm and composed, which some found admirable under the circumstances and others found unsettling. Sharon Rocha noticed it early. She expected a visible panic, but what she saw was restraint that it didn't take long for suspicion to creep into the background of the investigation. The husband is often the first person police look at in disappearances, and Scott's alibi, solo fishing trip, no witnesses, was less than airtight. Still, there was no evidence in those early days to link him directly to harm. The Modesto police asked the public for help. They wanted anyone who had seen Laci's Land Rover or a pregnant woman walking a golden retriever to come forward. They also put out a call for anyone who might have seen a brown canvas boat cover, which Scott told them had gone missing from his small fishing boat. Through the last days of December, the search became relentless. Modesto's parks, canals, and hiking trails were combed. Police divers worked in frigid water. The Rocha family made public appeals, their voices quivering but determined. Sharon's face was on every local broadcast, urging Laci to come home, urging anyone with information to speak up. Meanwhile, reporters began digging into Scott's background. On the surface, he was the picture of a clean-cut young husband. But whispers of marital strain began to emerge. Friends and acquaintances spoke of tensions over his work travel, his seeming lack of enthusiasm for the pregnancy. Nothing concrete, but enough for the media to frame their coverage with a question mark. That question mark grew larger in early January when the first crack in Scott's public image appeared. A woman named Amber Fry came forward with a shocking claim that she had been in a romantic relationship with Scott for over a month, and that he had told her he was single. In fact, Amber revealed Scott had told her his wife was dead, and that this would be his first Christmas without her, before Laci had even gone missing. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Suddenly, the story was no longer just about a missing woman. It was about betrayal, deception, and the possibility that the man appealing for her return might have been living a double life. The investigation into Jennifer Kest's disappearance unfolded in waves, each one beginning with a rush of hope and urgency, only to dissolve into the stagnant, heavy quiet of unanswered questions. In the weeks after January 24, 2006, the Orlando Police Department dedicated significant manpower to her case. Detectives worked 12-hour days, returning to her condo complex repeatedly, revisiting neighbors, maintenance staff, and construction crews. They knocked on every door in the surrounding area, showing Jennifer's photo, asking if anyone had seen her on that Tuesday morning. The frustrating thing was how little anyone could say with certainty. The mosaic at Millennia, while gated, was a hub of activity. The renovations meant contractors were constantly coming and going, and not all of them were familiar faces to residents. It wasn't unusual for someone to see a stranger walking in or out of the complex and think nothing of it. The fact that Jennifer was missing for hours before it was even noticed meant any critical witnesses might have seen something without realizing its importance at the time. Detectives interviewed coworkers, friends, Rob's family, and even acquaintances from her college years. Jennifer had no known enemies, no debts, no dangerous habits, and no involvement in anything illegal. Her life was stable: work, family, boyfriend, friends. She wasn't the kind of person who disappeared voluntarily, and every person who knew her emphasized how out of character this was. Her parents, Drew and Joyce, stayed in Orlando for weeks after her disappearance, transforming their hotel room into a kind of command post. They coordinated with law enforcement, printed and distributed flyers, and fielded calls from tipsters. Drew became the point man for handling information, keeping a detailed log of every lead, no matter how small. Joyce spoke to the media with the calm desperation of a mother determined not to let her daughter's face vanish from the public eye. The figure in the surveillance footage became an obsession, not just for detectives, but for the public. It was broadcast repeatedly on news stations, accompanied by the same maddening still images where the gate posts perfectly blocked the person's face. The figure's gait was studied by experts who tried to determine height and gender. Some believed it was a man, others thought a woman. The way the person's feet pointed outward as they walked was noted as distinctive. Yet despite the endless analysis, no one stepped forward to say, "I know who that is." Forensic analysis of Jennifer's condo didn't yield much. There was no sign of forced entry, and nothing appeared to be stolen. The assumption was that she had locked her door behind her when she left that morning. Some speculated she could have been confronted in the hallway or parking lot, possibly by someone she recognized enough to let her guard down. The Kesses funded private searches in addition to the official investigation. They brought in Texas Search, a volunteer search and recovery team specializing in missing person cases. Volunteers scoured overgrown fields, retention ponds, and wooded patches near Orlando. Cadaver dogs were deployed, but nothing conclusive was found. The Kesses even rented billboards with Jennifer's face and the words, "Have you seen me?" in bold, making her disappearance impossible to ignore for anyone driving through the city. As weeks turned to months, the official investigation began to slow, constrained by the lack of new evidence. Detectives followed up on every tip, but most were dead ends. Cases of mistaken identity, hoaxes, or information too vague to be actionable. Then came the rumors. In any high-profile missing person case, speculation can grow like weeds, and Jennifer's was no different. People whispered about a stalker, about jealous rivals, about potential encounters on her recent vacation. The police publicly stated there was no evidence to support these theories, but they couldn't stop them from spreading. Rob was questioned multiple times. His alibi was solid, but some in the public still wondered if their long-distance relationship had been strained. He spoke openly in interviews about how happy they had been and how surreal it was to go from talking to her one night to hearing she was missing the next day. The construction worker theory persisted. Detectives learned that many workers at the Mosaic were undocumented immigrants, which created challenges in tracking them down after the fact. Some had left the area entirely, moving to other states or even back to their home countries. Police were never able to account for every single person who had been working there at the time. For Jennifer's parents, the lack of closure was unbearable. They marked each passing birthday, holiday, and anniversary with both hope and grief. Joyce described feeling as if she had been dropped into a foreign world where time moved differently, where the future couldn't truly begin because the present was still stuck in January 2006. Years passed, and the case remained open but unsolved. The Orlando Police Department kept it on their books, occasionally revisiting leads, re-interviewing people, and reviewing evidence with fresh eyes. Advances in forensic technology offered glimmers of hope, but nothing concrete emerged. In 2010, the Kesses pushed for more outside involvement. They felt the investigation had stagnated and wanted a new perspective on the evidence. They were vocal about their frustrations, believing that certain avenues hadn't been fully explored. This advocacy kept Jennifer's name in the headlines and ensured her case wasn't forgotten. By 2018, the family took an extraordinary step. They sued the Orlando Police Department for access to the case files, hoping that by reviewing them with their own investigators, they might uncover something that had been missed. It was a move born of desperation but also of determination. They had spent over a decade without answers, and the idea of waiting passively for a break was no longer acceptable. When they finally gained access to tens of thousands of pages of records, they dove in. Their private investigator identified leads they believed were worth re-examining, including re-interviewing certain individuals and revisiting the timeline of the morning Jennifer vanished. They also uncovered witness statements about suspicious activity near her condo that hadn't been heavily pursued at the time. Still, the figure in the surveillance footage loomed over everything. Every theory, every piece of evidence, eventually looped back to that moment. Someone walking away from Jennifer's car, calm, purposeful, unrecognizable. The Kesses have never stopped searching. In interviews, Drew has said that the hardest part is not knowing, the limbo between hope and finality. For Joyce, the mission has become about more than just finding her daughter. It's about making sure Jennifer's case is never just another cold file gathering dust. Today, more than a decade later, the disappearance of Jennifer Kess remains one of Florida's most baffling mysteries. Her face still appears on missing person posters. Her story still surfaces in podcasts, documentaries, and online forums where armchair detectives dissect every detail. And somewhere, perhaps known only to one person in the world, is the truth about what happened in the early morning hours of January 24, 2006. The shoreline discoveries broke the case wide open. For months, suspicion had swirled in the abstract, anchored in Scott's affair, his peculiar calm, his dubious alibi. But now, the water had given up its secrets, and they were concrete, undeniable, and horrifying. The infant's remains, still tethered by an umbilical cord, suggested to investigators that Connor had died at or near the same time as his mother, not in some unrelated accident weeks later. The mother's body, or what was left of it, bore the silent testimony of time spent in cold, churning salt water. Though the tides and currents had stripped away any clear forensic evidence of the cause of death, the proximity of the two discoveries, both within a mile of each other, both in the very area Scott had placed himself on the day Laci vanished, was damning. News of the discovery hit Modesto like a physical blow. Neighbors left flowers and teddy bears on the Peterson lawn, but the mood had shifted. The gestures were now less about hope and more about mourning. The Rocha family retreated into their home, devastated yet resolute. Sharon Rocha's face, when she spoke to reporters, was carved in grief but edged with a grim certainty. She believed her daughter's killer had just been exposed by the tide. The Modesto police, coordinating with the California Department of Justice and the FBI, quietly began moving toward an arrest. Surveillance on Scott intensified. They knew the discovery of the bodies would be reported widely within hours, and they feared that the mounting evidence and the media frenzy it would ignite might push him to flee.in the days before. The formal identification was released. Scott's behavior became even more erratic. He had dyed his hair a light blonde, grown a goatee, and was driving a vehicle stocked with camping gear, several $1,000s in cash, his brother's driver's license, and a collection of survival items. To investigators, it looked less like a grieving husband's coping mechanism and more like a getaway plan. On April 18, 2003, before the public announcement of the DNA results, police moved in. They arrested Scott Peterson in a parking lot near a golf course in La Jolla, California. The charges: 2 counts of murder, 1 for Laci, 1 for Connor. His bail was denied. The prosecution argued he was a flight risk, citing his appearance changes and the suspicious contents of his car. The arrest set off a media storm unlike anything the Modesto police had seen before. Satellite trucks lined the streets outside the courthouse. National anchors broadcast live from the steps, their voices weaving between the personal tragedy and the spectacle of the case. Every detail of Scott's life was scrutinized: his marriage, his finances, his phone records, the minutiae of his fishing trip, and the timeline of his contact with Amber Fry. Amber, meanwhile, became an unexpected figure in the prosecution strategy. Her testimony would humanize the betrayal at the heart of the case. The prosecution planned to use her recorded calls to demonstrate Scott's pattern of deceit and to suggest that the affair provided a motive, a desire to escape the responsibilities of fatherhood and marriage without the public fallout of divorce. Sharon Rocha, Brent Rocha, and other family members attended the pretrial hearings, their presence a steady reminder of the human cost behind the headlines. In interviews, Sharon spoke about Laci not as a victim, but as a vibrant woman whose life had been stolen. She was our sunshine, and he took her away. The defense, led by attorney Mark Garagos, began laying the groundwork for an alternate narrative. They would argue that the case was circumstantial, that no physical evidence tied Scott to the killings, and that the remains could have been placed in the bay by someone else after Laci's disappearance became public. They hinted at the possibility of a random abduction, pointing to alleged sightings of Laci walking the dog after Scott left for the marina. Jury selection for the trial began in 2004, a process complicated by the case's saturation in the media. Nearly everyone called to serve had heard of Scott Peterson, and most had already formed an opinion. Garagos fought to have the trial moved out of Modesto, arguing that the local community had been too deeply affected to be impartial. The judge agreed, relocating the trial to Redwood City in San Mateo County. When the trial began in June 2004, it had all the trappings of a television drama: a handsome defendant in a tailored suit, a courtroom packed with press, and a gallery lined with both supporters and detractors. The prosecution opened with a portrait of Scott as a man living a double life, charming in public, deceitful in private, and a timeline that placed him at the heart of his wife's disappearance and death. They emphasized his trip to the bay, the missing boat cover, and the location where the bodies washed ashore. They played Amber Frey's recordings for the jury, her voice soft but steady as she asked him where he was, his answers vague and shifting. They called witnesses who testified to his lack of visible grief, his attempts to sell the house, and Laci's car, and his growing closeness to Amber even as the search for his wife continued. The defense countered by hammering the lack of direct evidence. No blood, no weapon, no eyewitness to a crime. They suggested that the bay was too vast for such a precise disposal, and they floated theories of a kidnapping gone wrong, perhaps tied to a burglary reported in the neighborhood around the time. Laci vanished. But the prosecution's case had something more visceral than forensics. It had the power of narrative. A young, pregnant woman, full of life, preparing for Christmas. A husband who told his mistress his wife was gone before she was missing. A fishing trip to the very place where her body and their unborn son would later surface. The jurors didn't need a smoking gun. They could see the outline of the truth in the shape of the lies. By November 2004, after months of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. The Rocha family sat together in the courtroom, holding hands, bracing themselves for the verdict that would not bring Laci back, but might offer a measure of justice. The jurors filed back into the Redwood City courtroom on November 12, 2004, their faces drawn, their eyes betraying the weight of the decision they carried. The gallery was silent except for the faint rustle of clothing as people shifted in their seats. In the front row, Sharon Rocha gripped Brent's hand, the strength of her clasp matched only by the thundering beat of her heart. Across the aisle, Scott Peterson sat at the defense table, his posture straight, his face unreadable, as if determined not to give the cameras or the jury any satisfaction. The clerk read the verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Laci Peterson. Guilty of second-degree murder for the death of Connor Peterson. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and irreversible. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Sharon Rocha closed her eyes, and for the first time since the ordeal began, she allowed herself to exhale, a deep, shaking release. On the defense side, Scott's mother, Jackie, clutched a tissue to her face, tears spilling freely. Scott did not cry. He did not collapse. He simply nodded slightly, his jaw tightening, a gesture so small it might have been missed if not for the bank of cameras trained on his every move. For the jurors, the evidence, though circumstantial, had been compelling enough to erase reasonable doubt. The trial moved into the penalty phase, where prosecutors argued for the death penalty. They painted Scott as cold and calculating, a man who had planned to rid himself of his wife and unborn child in order to pursue a life unburdened by responsibility, free to continue his affair. They replayed Amber Frey's recordings, reminding the jury of the callous timing of his lies. The defense pleaded for his life, pointing to the absence of direct physical evidence and appealing to the possibility, however remote, that someone else could have been responsible. They called friends and family to testify that Scott had once been a loving husband and son, that his life was worth sparing. The jury was unmoved. On December 13, 2004, they returned with their decision, death by lethal injection. In the courtroom, Sharon Rocha and her family held one another, knowing that no verdict, no sentence, could fill the empty space where Laci and Connor should have been. Scott was formally sentenced to death in March 2005 and sent to California's San Quentin State Prison, where he would join hundreds of other inmates on death row. The move to San Quentin, perched on the edge of the San Francisco Bay, carried its own cruel irony. From his cell, Scott could see the waters where prosecutors said he had left his wife and child to drift. For years, the case refused to fade from the public's mind. True crime documentaries, books, and endless online debates kept it alive. Some clung to the belief that Scott had been wrongly convicted, pointing to gaps in the investigation and the absence of forensic proof. Others saw the case as a textbook example of how circumstantial evidence, when layered deeply enough, can form a damning and complete picture. Sharon Rocha became an advocate for victims' families, speaking publicly about the pain of loss and the importance of persistence in seeking justice. In interviews, she often spoke not of Scott, but of Laci, of her laugh, her warmth, her plans for Connor's nursery, and the way she used to call just to share the smallest details of her day. For Sharon, keeping Laci's memory alive was the antidote to the cold headlines and trial transcripts that had consumed the last years of her life. Scott's attorneys filed a series of appeals, arguing jury misconduct, ineffective counsel, and prejudicial media coverage. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned his death sentence, citing errors in jury selection, though they upheld his conviction. In 2021, Scott was re-sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Sharon, the change in sentence did not alter the reality. He would never again walk free. Even decades later, the murder of Laci Peterson remains one of America's most haunting true crime cases, not just because of the tragedy itself, but because it shattered the illusion of the perfect suburban marriage. It was a reminder that evil can hide behind a smile, that the people we think we know best may be capable of the unimaginable. And it left an enduring image seared into the public consciousness, a pregnant woman, full of life, vanishing into thin air on Christmas Eve, and the husband whose lies unraveled into the truth.